Number 1, Exodus, 3rd quarter, 2025. Jon Paulien.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Lesson 1 in the quarter on Exodus. It's entitled Oppression, the Background, and the Birth of Moses. Dr. Jon Paulien is our moderator. Our opening prayer will be by Henry.
Eternal, self-sustaining, amazing friend. We come here today to have a conversation that we are sure you are part of. We are really thankful for all of the demonstrations that you have given through the biblical story, through our lives, through so many different ways in nature of your care, of your concern about us. And as we gather today under the lead of Dr. Paulien to discuss about the book of Exodus, to embark in this discovery about the actions, the reasons behind all of those interventions that you did, we also have the huge expectation of the Exodus that you have invited us to be part of as well. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for never leaving us alone. And with that confidence, we are ready to start this conversation. Amen.
Thank you, Henry. That was right on point. We appreciate that, and good to be reminded of God's care and his presence as we open his word. So we're starting a new quarter, and this quarter is on the book of Exodus. And to introduce the book of Exodus, it's helpful to do what we have in number 1. That is that the Old Testament centers on 4 great mighty acts of God: creation, the flood, the Exodus, and the exile to Babylon and the return. And if you go by the traditional chronology of the Bible, these are all events that are at least 1,000 years apart. So they're major turning points in history, and that God is in the middle of each one of them. The flood story is modeled on the creation. The Exodus is modeled on the creation and the flood, while the exile to Babylon and return are modeled on creation and the Exodus. So you see God reusing the way that the material from one event to another. One could say that God operated in a consistent way in all these mighty acts. And so there were threads that work all the way through these histories. So one could describe the major theme of the Old Testament prophets from Isaiah to Malachi as the new Exodus. So they were talking about the exile to Babylon as a new slavery in Egypt. And the return from Babylon will be a new Exodus. And so they could even describe it in terms of drying up of water and marching through the dry seabed, etc. So the book of Exodus is a major foundation for the rest of the Old Testament and of the New. So to know the book of Exodus well is to have important clues for the understanding of the rest of the Bible. Number 2, while Moses is in many ways the central character of the book of Exodus, the central character of the book is really God. The book of Exodus gives us a unique look at what God is really like, a God who is faithful to his people despite their unfaithfulness, a God of relationships. It's probably a good point to mention that the primary author of this series of lessons is Jiří Moskala. He is from the Czech Republic, and he's dean of the seminary at Andrews University and a good friend. And I think you will find yourselves very comfortable with his picture of God and the way he handles Scripture in this quarter. So, what does Paul have to say about the stories in Exodus? So 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11.
These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come.
All right, so for Paul, Exodus was an important book for Christians, for followers of Jesus. Paul understood that these stories were placed in the Scriptures for the sake of God's people in later days, and as he says, the ends of the world. The 13 weeks of this quarter will cover the 40 chapters of Exodus in weekly segments, 2 to 8 chapters in length. So the first lesson will cover just 2 chapters, but as we go through the book, sometimes there'll be 2, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes 6 or 8 chapters on a given week. So that basically means you have an opportunity to read the whole book of Exodus on less than a chapter a day. So during this quarter, if you dedicate yourself to a half a chapter a day, you'll make it through the entire book and be able to follow the lessons more closely. All right, let's read Exodus 2 and verses 23 through 25.
After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them.
All right, so what does it mean that God remembered his covenant? Has God been around a bit too long and memory failing? What is it that this expression communicates? Communicates about God and about the way he deals with people. All right, Livius?
Could we say that he doesn't forget by saying it this way? Can we say that God never forgets?
Okay, that's not the way we would do it in English, probably, but I think that's certainly an aspect of it in the Hebrew that God is saying, I'm here with you. But there is a bit of a sense of this is a local situation. In other words, remember the covenant means there's a time and a place to remember. And in the Hebrew language, remembering is more than just a mental exercise. There's an action element to the word. So when God remembers his covenant, it's another way of saying, yeah, he knew all along, but now it's time to act. So it's not just that God suddenly recalls something to mind that he had forgotten or simply was focusing elsewhere, but it's saying, yeah, God knew all along that the covenant would need to work out, but now is the time when God says, okay, it's time to act. Things are going to happen. So the book of Exodus is the story of an oppressed people who are delivered by God. That is the reason liberation theology is grounded in the Exodus, particularly in South America. A number of scholars have focused on the book of Exodus as a subject of liberation. Obviously, South America was settled by people from Europe, people who are not particularly democratic or caring about the local people. And there's always been a strong sense that a few elite people kind of dominate the poorer people. And so there arose in South America this idea of liberation theology, that just as God brought his people out of Egypt from their oppression, so that the book of Exodus has a message for people today who feel marginalized, left out by their own cultures. So liberation theology is grounded on the Exodus. The Old Testament prophets are grounded on the Exodus. Salvation in the New Testament is grounded on the Exodus. Even the cross is grounded on the Exodus. The same God who saved the Hebrews then can save us as well, I think is the message that comes through. To the oppressed, the book is a source of encouragement. To the blessed, it's a call to go the second mile in order to help those who are oppressed. So that's an introduction to a large degree to the whole quarter. God saw the people suffering, and it was time to act. So let's go back and get the context of that verse, that passage, back to chapter 1, Exodus 1, and verses 1 through 7.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them.
All right, so Israel was in Egypt, and it goes back to the story of Joseph as is noted here. And Israel prospered and flourished in Egypt. It was a great place. Egypt is a place where it pretty much never rains, but the ground is fertile and there's plenty of water because the water comes all the way down from the Ethiopian highlands and it is abundant. I remember a time I was at the Adventist Academy in the Nile Delta, and I was there for about a week, and on 3 days of that week, they got unlimited water for a period of a couple hours. And it was just like a fountain in the middle of the campus, and just water came gushing out. And what they had done was prepare channels all the way through. It's like 35 acres of orange trees. And so they would just channel that water from one place to another, and the gardener would go by and he'd make up little dams, to stop the water here, but send it over there. And then he'd break through the dam and send it over here. And so there was a whole process about 3 times that week of flooding the place with irrigation. So there's abundant water. The ground is very fertile. So even though it never rains, they can grow amazing crops. And I always will remember the salads in the academy, the best I ever had, because the vegetables were grown in such rich and fertile soil. So the Israelites found that a wonderful place. Egypt always had a surplus of food to sell or to trade. And that produced what we call today generational wealth. As people are constantly experiencing a surplus, the family prosperity grows and grows. Along with that, there was growth in population. Nobody was starving. People were living a long time. They were in good health. It was good times in Egypt. So when they went to Egypt, there were 70 individuals. And we presume that these are males, so maybe the total might have been a couple hundred people. But they went to Egypt as 70. How many were there when they passed through the Red Sea? You'll find that in Exodus 12, Exodus 12:37.
The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children.
All right, so you had 600,000 men, and presumably women and children, you get close to 2 million. All right. So you have 70 individuals. There's 4 or 5 generations, and these 70 men are now 600,000. And that's a major criticism that many people have of biblical history. How do you go from 70 to 600,000 in 4 or 5 generations? Because when they came to Egypt, it was 215 years before the Exodus. So when you do your numbers and stuff and the length of lives that were typical back then, I did some numbers, and you could get to 600,000 from 70 in 5 generations if every person, not just every woman, but every person had 10 children and nobody died. So there'd be 20 children per family and nobody dying. So this is a challenge for biblical scholars. How do you get from 70 to 600,000? Well, what solutions can you think of? I'm going to offer one, but it may not be the only one or the best one. Neil.
We're assuming that no Egyptians joined them.
And that would be an additional number.
Yeah.
Are you saying some of those 600,000 are the Egyptians?
Yeah, because women would probably marry men that were not of their own group. And you had men that would be marrying outside of the group too. So you had others that were brought into the group.
So you're cutting it down to about 10 children per family if half of the group is now Egyptians.
Yeah.
Okay. I like that idea. That may be part of the solution, even if it's not the whole solution. Anyone else? Bob?
Well, there's this constant reference to the mixed multitude. So could there be some that are of other groups, not intermarried at all with the Hebrews, who could have joined them?
Yeah, and I would assume, like with Neil's comment, that probably they weren't the majority, or you'd kind of lose your whole culture. But that certainly could explain some of the numbers, perhaps. Anyone else with an idea? It's a tough problem. That's why people wrestle with it. For me, the most interesting possibility is with the numbers themselves. And the interesting thing is that the number 1,000 is not required by the Hebrew. The Hebrew word is elef, and an elef can be 1,000. It can be a family unit, like a mother and father and 7 or 8 kids or something like that. It can be a military unit, The smallest military unit is sometimes called a platoon, although in the United States military, a platoon is usually about 40 people, and then they're divided into 3 or 4 squads of 10 to 12 people. So if you think of the Aleph as the smallest military unit as a squad, you're talking about maybe 10 people. If you think of a family unit as, somewhere between 8 and 12 in ancient times. So if you apply that, you see the word thousand we get from the Greek. The Greek translators, the Septuagint, translated Aleph as 1,000, but that wasn't compelling in the sense that they didn't have to do it that way. And if you work the Hebrew through the Bible, you'll see that it has various options. So another factor there is that we know where David's city is. David's Jerusalem is a very clearly defined area just south of the old city today. And it's been excavated a lot in recent years, and one can now visit it and see some interesting things there, including the wall of David's palace, and not the pool of Siloam, but the fountain that led to it is in that part as well. So when you look at the city of Jerusalem, it's just a few hundred yards long and much less wide. So I'd sometimes say it's like a par 5 on the golf course. Par 5s are like 500 yards long and maybe 50 to 100 yards wide. That's the city of David. That's the capital of the Israelite Empire. And it says that the armies of David were 800,000 for Israel and 500,000 for Judah. It's 1,300,000 men. But the city that governs the whole thing would hold about 1,500 people. So there's something not quite connecting there. And so if you follow the smaller view of the Aleph, David's army now becomes 13,000 rather than 1,300,000. And that gets a lot closer to the evidence that we have for the size of towns and the population that was likely there. So archaeologically, that's a strong indication. And if you follow that here, you would end up with about 6,000 men instead of 600,000. And now, when you talk about each generation, now you only need 3 children per generation, assuming nobody dies. And since people die, that still allows for families 4, 5, 6 children. And roughly you could go from 70 to 6,000 in 5 generations that way. So then the numbers now begin to fit. You don't have to buy that solution. And in fact, Ellen G. White in Patriarchs and Prophets says there were 2 million that came out. All right. So we acknowledge that. And if you assume that she had inspired knowledge of that number, in other words, that God whispered in her ear, write that down. It's 2 million. Nothing more, nothing less. You see, if you assume that that was divinely guided, the number, then you should go with that and leave the problems to God, who will explain it all someday. If you assume that the King James Bible, which followed the Septuagint, more than the Hebrew in the Old Testament, if you assume that that is divinely guided, then you should go with that, But for those of us who like to have reasonable answers to some of these things, I offer you that option. Livius.
Another thought is to look at the Egyptians. In chapter 1, it says that they were afraid because they were multiplying so much. So you could make another comparison of like, well, what must have the population been in order to have the Egyptians fear them to take over them?
Would depend on the size of the Egyptian population.
Yeah, right.
Which we don't really know as well. So we do have a pretty good idea of the situation in Canaan because there's been a lot of archaeology done. Obviously, people very, very interested in the archaeology of the biblical lands and biblical sites. So there's a lot of work that's been done. We have a pretty good idea of how many people lived in certain places. Nazareth, for example, had 400 inhabited caves. And if you assume a family group in each one of those, the population of Nazareth was 2,000 or 3,000. It wasn't 300,000 like a major site might be today. So when you start looking at those kinds of pictures, that's where people are saying, if we read the Hebrew in a different way, the numbers start to work. And it's not important for salvation or anything, but I do like to be aware of possibility. So, and again, when critics come along and say, the Bible is completely off base here, you can say, well, there are translations of the Bible that are clearly off base, but it doesn't mean that is exactly where the Hebrew went. All right. If anyone has a question on that, Daniel?
It's interesting that Jochebed, the mother of Moses, had 3 children. So Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. That's much closer to what you calculated than 20 children.
That's an additional excellent little piece. So at least that one family was not the 15 or 20 that were needed. So their fertility evidently was not called in question by mentioning that Moses' own family was relatively small. Excellent point. Thank you. All right, let's go to Exodus 1, 8 to 11.
Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh.
I noticed someone mentioned in the chat that 3 is not a lot where you have no birth control, and I think that is true. But I'd also note that child mortality was much greater than, you think of Ellen White's own family. She had 4 children. Only 2 of them made it into adulthood, and that was probably pretty standard for the early 19th century. So it's amazing how the care of infants and so on, at the level that we have today, and eliminating some of those early childhood diseases that were so deadly, has changed the picture. And so people today don't want to have usually more than 2 or 3 children, because if all your children grow up to be adults, you're going to have a hefty college bill. Imagine with 12 children today. How would you make it through? So, yeah, people are making business decisions regarding how many children they're willing to have. Jennifer.
When I read verses 8 through 11, it makes me wonder why they didn't fight back or leave instead of letting themselves become slaves. Of course, in the numbers that you were just talking about, if they weren't as numerous as we thought, it would be harder for them to fight back. But if there weren't that very many of them, why didn't they just leave?
Yes, that's an interesting observation. I don't know that I have an answer for you, except that they were not allowed to leave, that everything was great. I mean, who would want to leave, right? Canaan has not a whole lot more rain than Egypt, but they don't have the water resources. So when it rains, everything's great. When it doesn't rain, you have famines. And that's what happened several times with the patriarchs. They ended up having to go down to Egypt because the land was not producing enough. So, yeah, I have the feeling that at first they wouldn't want to go because things were way better than they would be wherever they went. And once they realized that the Egyptians had it in for them, they probably were not in a position to go, certainly not en masse. Some may have gone, but for, whether it's 20,000 or 2 million just to get up and leave, especially if they're producing labor, Let's see, someone says mortality rate in 1950 in Egypt, 275 per thousand. That's fairly recently. 1950, mortality was still 1 in 3 in Egypt. So they became a threat to the Egyptians. Their sheer numbers were a threat. And the Egyptians tried to get control of them by enslaving them, exploiting their labor, etc. And it's interesting, the author mentions that the book of Exodus begins in slavery and ends in sanctuary peace. So the book of Exodus is a story of the triumph of God over difficult circumstances that humans may impose on each other. All right, number 6. When Jacob's family arrived in Egypt after experiencing famine in Canaan, Genesis 46, the Egyptian king was friendly toward the Hebrews because of Joseph and all that he'd done for the Egyptians. So let's read Genesis 41 and verses 41 to 43. So we're going back before Exodus to catch a bit of background. Genesis 41 and verses 41 to 43.
And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt.
All right, so Joseph was in a very favored position, and this was done because he was providing solutions to the nation's biggest problem. And so he became Pharaoh's chief of staff. In the American situation, the chief of staff is an unelected person chosen by the president to handle pretty much everything that the president can't handle himself or herself. So Joseph was in the second highest position in the land that gave him almost absolute power in every situation. So the lesson asks the question, what were the keys to Joseph's success? And it gives a series of texts. So, Terry, if you would read those three passages in Genesis, the first one is chapter 37, verses 26 to 28, and then further from there. So the question that these texts are responding to is, what were the keys to Joseph's success? What was necessary for him to be as successful as he was?
Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt.
All right, so if you're looking at the big picture, God, he needs Joseph to get to Egypt in order to save his people. I'm sure there's a lot of ways that could have happened, but this is the way it did happen. And when you look at it through Joseph's eyes, this is the worst thing that could possibly have happened. But in a picture, in God's mind, that went way beyond Joseph's lifetime. He saw that this move was critical to their survival as a people, that in Egypt they would be given their own unique piece of land. They didn't really mingle much with the Egyptians. They had their own unique culture, their faith, all the rest of that, and everything was good until the oppression came. So the first step in Joseph's success is he needed to get to Egypt, but he probably wasn't thrilled about the method. All right, we have a couple people waiting patiently, so we'll start with Rita.
I wonder if an important verse in Exodus, which might explain why God remembered his covenant with Abraham at that time, was because the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And that should remind us of Genesis 1, where Adam and Eve were told that they would fill the world. And then you've got the promises to Noah and Abraham in particular about filling the land. And they've got to the point now in this beginning of Exodus that they've filled the land, and that's as far as they can go, as far as the Egyptians will allow them to go. So if they're going to fill any more of the land, then God's got to move them on. It's time he has to take action so that they can continue to fill the land.
The connection with Genesis 1, I think, is an excellent one. To be fruitful and multiply. So Egypt was the place where they could multiply. Canaan was kind of uncertain. It rains sometimes, it doesn't sometimes. So there's no Nile River. The Jordan River is just a trickle compared to the Nile. So Egypt was a place where they were safe and they could grow and multiply and to achieve God's long-term purpose. All right, Terry, continue with those texts, Genesis 39 now.
The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master.
All right, and then verses 21 and 22.
But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it.
All right, so you have, first of all, he needed to get to Egypt. Second of all, he was faithful in everything he did. He served, he did well. Both the jailer and Potiphar, who may possibly be the same person, depends on how you read the Hebrew, But in each case, he received favor with those who were enslaving him, and they prospered for blessing him. And then God was with him. So the three keys to his success are being where God needed him to be, being faithful with whatever was put before him, faithful in little things, if you will. And then the fact that he walked with God on a regular basis. It was a long time, a good 13 years or so between the imprisonment and the elevation. During a lot of that time, it must have been pretty discouraging. But Joseph was successful in completing the mission that God had in mind for him. Jennifer.
Well, my point was kind of previous to this also, but you were talking about how Jacob already was in Canaan. And so you wonder why God had them leave to Egypt and then have to come back. But I found interesting in Genesis 15:16, when Abraham had the vision from God and he showed him that it was going to be 4 generations before the descendants would come back. And then he says, because I will not drive out the Amorites until they become so wicked that they must be punished. So it sounds like God was considering other things as well during this whole view of history about the Canaanite nations around, that he was going to give them time to know about him and respond before he was going to have the Israelites come back and take over their land.
Yeah, this is where it makes sense to trust God, right? Because he has this whole big picture in view. And part of that big picture was they would end up in Egypt. The prophecy doesn't say how. People often think, well, if we study the prophecies, we'll know exactly what's going to happen in the future and we'll be prepared for everything. No, the prophecy didn't say how they were going to get to Egypt. That one of them would be enslaved ahead and that he would be elevated to leadership and then they would be called down and stuff. All of that develops in the course of history. They're not given that kind of information ahead of time. But the prophecy was clear enough, but not in the details. And so God was doing what he needed to do, but he was doing so respecting also the free will of the people like Judah, who decided to sell Joseph into slavery rather than killing him, as some of his brothers wanted to do. That was a personal choice, but God used that choice to bring Joseph down to Egypt and put him in situations where he would end up being very successful and making a big difference, which had a huge impact on the history of Israel afterward. All right, Iris?
I would like to raise one more antecedent factor. Possibly. This is a question. Was it vital that for Joseph personally, the way up required the way down first? Was he personally only able to handle this immense power because he suffered this utter humiliation, because he embraced the God of his fathers during time of abandonment, during time of incredible suffering, and getting to know God in the depth of human experience, God meeting him there? And was he only then prepared to handle this amazing calling, this powerful calling? And I think there's a parallel in Moses' life. The 40 years with the sheep abandoned in the desert. Is that a principle? Is that something that was also key to what unfolded then?
Those people who are most fit to rule are those who have suffered the most. And they have compassion for those who suffer and for those who need. There is a pattern in the Bible. Like Joseph's story, he started out the favored son, right? Everything was great. And then he went through a period of a very severe trial, and then he was elevated to the highest place. Moses started out as daughter, the queen's son, and had everything going for him. And then he had the period in the desert, as you noted. And then he comes back and is fitting into God's purpose. David, he was favored of the king for much of those early years and was very successful. And then suddenly he's in exile and a fugitive for a long time. and then he's elevated to kingship. Daniel, he's a prince of Judah, but then gets exiled to Babylon and ends up prime minister. So there's kind of a pattern. And in my understanding, the way the New Testament uses these stories, they see that as the picture of Jesus, that he was in the highest place in the universe before he came to this earth. And then he spent 33 years of exile here on this earth and was elevated back to the throne. That, in other words, those who knew the Old Testament should not have expected the Messiah to appear in the glory stage. Suffering comes before the glory, and suffering's the preparation for the glory, for the rule, etc. Livius.
I don't want to bring the conversation down, but I was thinking about the oppression that they had to go into slavery by the Egyptians. Is it fair to say, like, from Joseph to this period in time, wouldn't have Joseph put in some of his own people into positions of leadership? So even the Egyptian administrative system, kingdom, would have had like important people that were from Israel in those positions, and how they had to remove them and stuff. And
yeah, well, let's go to the next number, because that will get us right into that. I don't doubt that Joseph did that. The question is, were those hereditary positions, or were they like today, when one president goes out, all these people lose their jobs, and now they bring in new people once again? But here's the history in number 7. According to the lesson, all right, and I will be very honest with you, these are disputed dates. There's a lot about Egyptian history we don't know. There's some missing gaps. And so some people think the Exodus was as late as 1200 BC. Some people think the Exodus never happened, that it's just a grand story of a people who are always in Canaan, trying to grandiose their history a little bit. But if we take the Bible at its word as a historical record, then the numbers that are here fit with the biblical record as it reads. And the Bible suggests that there's 215 years from Joseph's elevation to the Exodus story. So if Joseph was elevated 1665 BC, and he was about 30 years old at the time, he died at 110. So that would take you to about 1585, the death of Joseph. And now you're coming into the kings who come after it. So this is from the lesson. The author of the lesson is an Old Testament scholar. I trust his knowledge on these numbers much better than my own. So we'll go with these as the agreed basis for our understanding this quarter. According to the lesson, the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph was Ahmose, 1570 to 1546. By our calculations, that would be about 15 years after Joseph died. And you say, well, that's still pretty close, isn't it? Yes, it is. On the other hand, I'm the last living member of the Daniel and Revelation Committee, which closed just 34 years ago. And vast numbers of pastors and even scholars are hardly at all familiar with the work of that committee, which carefully looked at Daniel and Revelation for over a period of a dozen years. And if within one generation, such a pivotal activity can be nearly forgotten, I think there are some folk trying to resurrect it right now in the last couple of years, and I'm glad for that. But it was a very critical work. If that can happen even in modern times, when you have the internet and everything like that, it should not be surprising if in a matter of years one might forget that. Somebody asked, are all the members of DARCOM dead? Probably not, but I'm not aware of any of the members that are functioning widely in the church today. I was a bit younger than most of them, and that made a difference. Dick Davidson attended one of the meetings, and he's still working full-time at the seminary. But as somebody who was familiar with the committee over several years, and sometimes 2 meetings a year, I'm the only person left that really has a strong sense of what on there from year to year. So we have then Ahmose, 1570 to 1546. This is number 7 in your handout. Next was Amenhotep the first, 1546 to 1526. The ruler who feared the Israelites and began to oppress them, it was this Amenhotep. Then Thutmose issued the death decree for all the Hebrew babies. His daughter was Hatshepsut, who ended up the princess who adopted Moses, and she ended up actually queen of Egypt. for a considerable period of about 20 years. Thutmose III, 1504 to 1450, was co-regent with Hatshepsut for 21 years and was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So the Exodus occurred in 1450 BC, so probably around 215 years from the arrival of Jacob in Egypt until the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. If Jacob arrived in Egypt around 1665, Joseph's death would have been around 1592 BC, which fits the above timeline very well. All right, so number 8, Exodus 1, 9 through 21. And here's where the story gets very interesting. Exodus 1, verses 9 to 21.
He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase and, in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh.
The momentary, I'm just pointing out, people were asking, why didn't they leave? And apparently here, one of the motivations for the slavery was to prevent their leaving. So the Egyptians did not have the intent that they were free to go, at least not after the time of Joseph's Pharaoh. So that's a little piece, a little twist in the story, I think, that's helpful. All right, verse 12 and on.
But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families.
All right, so the question is, what key role did the midwives play, and why are they remembered in history? And the associated question, how would you deal with the seeming approval in the scriptures of a made-up story or misinformation? Jennifer?
Maybe there was some truth in what they were saying, so maybe they weren't outright lying. Maybe they did give birth very easily and were born before they got there.
I'm looking for the piece of the story that, see, because it says in the text that when these babies were born, they were to kill the male and let the female live. And it says they did not do. They were instructed to do. So it does appear they made a choice not to follow that command. And their excuse was that, well, we didn't get there in time. All right. So, Henry?
I feel that sometimes we forget, or probably I'm wrong, that the story is just a depiction of what happened, obviously on the perspective of the writer. If we will ask an Egyptian, they will not have given the adjective of faithful midwife, right? So this is actually the perspective of a Jew person talking about how faithful they were with the people, not faithful with God, not faithful with anybody, but faithful to the people, right? Obviously, they were defending their own people. So that's my first take on the other one. And then with that saying that there is no need to defend, because the Bible, implying that just because the Bible tells us this story, that God is endorsing the behavior. God is so transparent that let us know without any censure what happened, what people thought, so we can understand the background of the story. But this is not necessarily a prescriptive reading to say, okay, so you can lie whenever you are doing in God's favor because he is with you. And I have the same comments with Joseph. God wasn't being partial, selecting only this man and determining him to be the one successful, because there are many people that are faithful, that are in the right place, that behave always good, that do not get and end up in those high level positions. So this is just the story written from the Moses perspective.
I think it does make it clear they feared God and that God approved of their actions. All right, Iris?
Well, I do want to point out this is an encounter with the nursing and midwifery in the Bible. It's the story, and that's to be noted. I secondly want to note the boldness of these women in the chapter before Moses gets called by God. And they stand. And it's an act of faith in the face of a moral dilemma. And I think oppressive systems like to use, for example, midwives touch individual families. So if you have an oppressive political system that instrumentalizes for its murdering a profession that is called to help, to bring life into this world, and now you are asking these same people to murder life. We know what it looks like when Hitler did this with his machinery, when helping professions became part of medical experiments and murdering. And the only answer that these professionals gave in the Nuremberg trials was, we just followed orders. And so in this sense, I see these women as people who were following their own moral compass in a time that was very, very difficult. And because they feared God, they chose to resist. And resistance can sometimes mean you delay your coming. There are always ways. There are always ways. But it is important that the moral compass inside is set correctly.
Yeah, see, that's beautiful, Iris. You bring in the nursing perspective here. Often in medicine, there are these dilemmas, ethical dilemmas. If you do this, there'll be that consequence. If you do that, there'll be the other consequence. And the patient wants this, but the family wants that. And so what do you do at times like this? And I think it's helpful to highlight this piece of the story. It's interesting that in Patriarchs and Prophets, only the approval is mentioned, that they were doing the right thing, etc. When you look at the larger story here, you have a dilemma, in this case, between doing something murderous and telling something not quite true, or not true in every case, most likely. Or, interesting suggestion, they showed up late. This is what we call passive resistance. But I think often when you get into situations like that, people feel that they may be bound by certain biblical principles to act in ways that get people hurt. And that here it seems like the Bible is giving a little bit of, to weigh the consequences of how you are being faithful. And sometimes God weighs in remarkable ways. I remember the story of a family who was hiding some Jews in their house during the war. And they had a very innovative way to do so. That is, the hatch down into the basement was covered by the dining room table. And they put a carpet over the hatch under the dining room table. And so you'd have to go to great lengths to actually discover there is even a hatch there. It just looks normal. And so when the guards came in and they said, "Where are the Jews?" nobody answered except a 12-year-old retarded girl who said, "They're under the table." And the guards were silent for a moment and then absolutely broke up in laughter and just turned around and left. So there the truth was told, and yet the Jews were saved. So God can work mightily, but the women decided they knew if they told Pharaoh exactly what was going on, that something much worse would happen and they could do nothing about it. And it seems that what Pharaoh did was to do a workaround to the midwives. If you see verse 22, says he gave this order to everybody. Every boy that's born, you must throw into the Nile. but let every girl live. So if you ran into a male Hebrew baby, your legal obligation was to throw it in the river. All right. So the midwives, he was no longer counting on the midwives to be any help in this project. Bob.
Well, we'll run into another issue later on this. We're not to the lesson yet, but when Israel went into Canaan and then Rahab was approached by the spies, you have two spies and a prostitute. And should she have told the truth, I think she's in the lineage of Christ. She was saved. So, and of course, now when we're counseling people for court, we tell them to tell the truth, because one of the things we've discovered is judges and juries tend to accept the fact that even if stories don't match up exactly between witnesses, it's more credible when the truth is told. But here you have examples, and I don't know, I'd like to know in the hereafter kind of how it's seen, because that's a fairly blatant example of lying and saving. Obviously, the person who became the later leader of the first judge was one of the spies, if I recall right. We're talking, Jericho.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I wondered about that for a long time. I think Iris has given a very credible explanation that sounds pretty good, but I've tried to figure out on this other one, how does that work?
And let me be very, very clear. To take this as, a license to lie whenever you want and so on would be a serious, serious mistake. Most of us will never be in these kinds of dilemmas. But those who end up in these types of dilemmas often end up with huge levels of guilt because they broke a commandment. And to recognize that even in Scripture, there are people who are weighing serious ethical dilemmas. And when you've done the best that you can, you lay it before God and say, if this is the wrong thing, please forgive me, but I was seeking to do the best that I could understand. And I think God respects those kind of decisions when they're made, not as a license to sin or have fun with it, but in times of deep, deep crisis, God respects the fact that there is often no simple answer, no easy answer. Aaron.
Rahab, I think that the answer that she gave was in line with faith. To tell the legal truth would have been not faith. It would have been siding with her people rather than siding with this other option, the God of the Hebrews. I don't know what was going through her mind exactly, but Paul has her in the heroes of faith. So
that's right. That is correct. Now, here's a little piece. We know the names of these midwives. What was the name of Pharaoh? What was the name of his daughter? We don't know. So that's another little hint that God was honoring the actions that they did. They may have had a choice between two evils, but they chose the much lesser of the evils. And as Patriarchs and Prophets says, the Lord approved their course and prospered them. All right, Exodus 2, verses 1 to 10.
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river.
I just wanted to ask the question, why did she make a basket and put him in the river? It's a great children's story. But is there a specific reason why she did exactly what she did? What did the law say?
Throw them into the river. So she did.
Throw them into the river. She was following the law. This is what we might call creative compliance. When a person complies with the law while at the same time circumventing its intention. Very creative. I thought it was worth pointing out. Let's see, were we on verse 5?
She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, I drew him out of the water.
So if the author is correct, Pharaoh's daughter was probably the single most famous woman in all of Egyptian history. Hatshepsut. If you go to the Luxor area today, there's a temple of Hatshepsut, and it is huge and magnificent and largely intact. It's an amazing complex. Was it providence or was it strategy that the daughter of Pharaoh came at just that time and place? I don't know that we have an answer to it, but I'm just posing the question. It's interesting. They put the basket in the river and along comes Pharaoh's daughter. Was little Miriam spying out the spot for some time, knowing they would need it? Or was it just God's providence? Pharaoh's daughter says, I'm in the mood for a bath. Let's go now. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it opens up dimensions of the story that are interesting to pursue. Iris.
I'd like to say what you often say, God meets people where they are. And I think that family was probably praying their hearts out. And they knew at this point only if God's divine intervention would happen, but they didn't know. And nobody knows, when you make that step by faith, you don't know how God will respond. He did, So it is an interplay between the individual believer, their faith, their creativity, and then God meeting them in that space.
Thank you for that. Neil.
The other thing is we don't know if it happened the first day or the 100th day. We do know that Miriam was there to keep an eye on the basket, but that's all.
How many 5-year-olds would stay there for 100 days?
Hey, kids playing by water happens all the time.
Very good. But here's the interesting thing, is that not only was Moses placed in a good home where he'd get a good education, have plenty to eat, all the training one could possibly imagine, training for warfare, training for governance, etc., got all those things, but his mom got him for the early years. Ellen White sometimes talks about the first 3 years, other times about the first 7 years. But those early years are so critical in the formation of character and the direction that the life will take in the end. So this is the best of all possible situations. Moses' life was saved. Not only did he live, but he got to live in an amazing situation. And his mom had 12 years to train him up right. So that's an amazing story of God's providence. Hatshepsut died when he was probably about 21 years old. And it seems that after her death, the younger natural-born son, Thutmose III, was the one who took her place. And let's see, according to the timeline here, he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So, the Charlton Heston version is paying attention to the text that these were like brothers. One was natural born, the other was not. And Moses didn't end up getting that kingship. And some maybe 15 years after Hatshepsut died is when you have Moses killing the Egyptian and things going downhill from there. Neil.
There's one other thing that we have to remember. At a time when the Israelites were being forced to labor and getting lousy nutrition, here Moses, because of this connection, was getting decent nutrition because the queen would be taking care of it to make sure that he had what he needed.
Hey, he lived to be 120.
Yep, he had a good head start. The other Israelites didn't.
Yeah.
He made it to the edge of the promised land. How many of the others that went through the Exodus did? None.
Yeah, that's right. So number 11, as we're drawing toward a close here, God used Moses' rash action. Remember killing the Egyptian? Happened when he was about 40. So let's go back to the timeline. Thutmose III died in 1450, the time of the Exodus. And so he ruled 54 years. So he had probably been 14 years as king, 14 years after the death of Moses' mother, that the incident happened with the Egyptian. And then Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness. So here's a fun question for you. God used Moses' rash action to ultimately deliver his people. If Moses had not killed the Egyptian, would the Israelites not have been freed from Egypt? And to put the question more broadly, will the universe ultimately be better off because of sin? Neil's shaking his head vigorously. You're welcome to start the discussion if you would like.
We wouldn't have been in this position in the first place if it hadn't been for sin.
Yeah. Well, there's two different questions, but they're related in the sense that, if Moses hadn't killed the Egyptian, does that mean the Israelites wouldn't have escaped? It's one question. The other question is the broad one. If there had never been sin, the other option, would the universe ultimately better off because of sin? Is our training longer and more detailed and more effective, etc.? Anyway, just a thought question. Iris?
I'm tempted to ask, would Jesus have died if Judas had not given him away?
There you go. Another one.
And to me, what it shows us here is, in the later case, I believe it didn't take Judas, it would have happened anyway. But I shouldn't want to be in Judas's shoes, and be responsible for that. In this case, it shows basically that even our grossest mess ups, God can work with it. God can overrule. God's purposes will prevail. Sometimes even, as we see in Revelation 17, 18, even the atrocious acts of the evil side has to then fulfill God's purposes. So to me, this is very hopeful.
Iris made mention of another class that we're involved in where we were looking at Revelation 17, and you have Babylon's destruction by its own followers, and they were doing their will. But the next verse says, God put it into their minds to be of one mind and to do his purpose. So Revelation argues the case that the enemies of God are following their own plan, and in so doing, they are cooperating with God. So God's oversight of these events is there. Jennifer?
It says something about God to me that no matter what we've done, God takes the rest of our life and can make beautiful things out of it and do wonderful things out of the rest of our lives.
That's such an important point, Jennifer. All other things being equal, God doesn't want Moses to kill the Egyptian, period. And the Egyptian, in this case, while he was a concentration camp guard, you could say, and maybe guilty by definition or something like that, but probably was not somebody who deserved what Moses did at that moment. And all other things being equal, God does not want that to happen. But when that reality comes and Moses suffers his exile and all the rest of that, God used that and still accomplished his purpose. Yeah, so it's very important to remember. Neil?
You've mentioned it twice, the exile of Moses. He had to unlearn an awful lot. How about the exile of Saul? How much did he have to unlearn? And we're all in that condition. We have these things that we carry with us that we need to unlearn. And sometimes it takes a lot longer for some than it does for others. It took the children of Israel 40 years in the wilderness. It took Moses 40 years as a shepherd. It took Saul, 12, 14 years before he went back to Jerusalem? And still we all carry these things. They all did.
Someone says that God is the quintessential lemonade maker. I like the way that was put, that God is able to make something of it. Yeah. Daniel made a comment in the chat, the daughter of the man who set out to destroy the Hebrews. So she must have known. And she says, this is a Hebrew. She knew what was going on. The daughter of the man who set out to destroy the Hebrews is the one who saves them by saving Moses, though she knows that it is a Hebrew boy. So God is able to weigh the decisions, the thought processes of people, to put that all in calculation. And I think the bottom line here is that when we learn to trust God, it gives us tremendous peace because we can go ahead and make decisions. We can make difficult ethical decisions. We can make mistakes. We can face challenging situations and sort of throw a dart into the wind, hoping we'll hit the right spot, etc. But we can live in confidence that God can use what we do and that we don't have to live in constant fear, in constant remorse, self-flagellation for all the things we did or didn't do. Someone asked me recently about a certain church decision and said, how are you doing? Are you deeply distressed about it? I said, no, God is ultimately in control. And he can use what I do, or he can use what I don't get to do. He can use what the church decides, whatever it is. God is not surprised. God will be able to accomplish his purposes. So the beauty of all this is the double sense is that what I do matters. My purpose in life matters. But when things go wrong, when we don't get where we thought we were heading, God can use that too. And his mission is aided by people like me, but it isn't dependent on people like me. John?
To me, the beginning of Exodus is all about the faithfulness of God. Chapter 1 begins with God's fulfillment of his promise through Adam and Noah and Abraham. The nation becomes a multitude. And then as chapter 1 continues, those who do right, Pharaoh's daughter, the midwives, God blesses and supports. And then chapter 2, with regards to Moses, Moses saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew and did what he thought was right and stepped in. So Moses did what was right by slaying the Hebrew, but it ends with, out of slavery, the cry, God hears the cry. So 3 occasions Moses is righteous, a righteous man. He defends the Hebrew, he tells the Hebrews to stop fighting, and he defends the women at the well. And then God defends the Israelites by hearing their cry. So it's all about faithfulness of God.
Amen. Daniel, last word.
And to show the decency of the Pharaoh's daughter, she even offers to pay a wage to a slave for nursing the baby.
Mm. Well, if it's Hatshepsut, she's renowned as a great woman, so much more than would appear just in this story. Let's pray. Dear Lord, fascinating story. Most of us have not gone deeply into it before, but as we studied this together, we sense guidance in many challenging situations, that you work with people who face difficult situations, make difficult decisions, sometimes make mistakes, but you work through all of those. Moses certainly made a mistake in murdering the Egyptian. The midwives faced a horrible dilemma and made a decision that you recognized as faithful. Lord, you can make amazing things out of our mistakes and perhaps even more through our successes. So we pray that you'd give us the courage to trust you and to follow your leading, be sensitive to the Holy Spirit, sensitive to your word, recognizing that your word doesn't cover every possible situation. You invite us to use our heads, to think, to pray, to plan, and to do the best that we can, seeking to be in harmony with your word wherever possible. So we thank you for all this guidance, and we thank you for the Exodus story and invite you to be with us in the week to come for Jesus' sake. Amen.